start my share my screen and start this. Let me go here, and we're going to go to here. This one here. So let's put this in full screen. Can everybody see the screen here?
Got it.
Okay, let's play.
Well, I'm here this morning to share the story of how science, especially astronomy and physics, brought me into the Christian fold. And you heard that I got my PhD from the
University of Toronto. I was born, raised, and educated in Canada, where we look at the problem of evil. And here's the amazing thing. God actually designed all the laws of physics to target the problem of evil. And that's why those laws of physics will not exist in new creation, because evil won't be there. But in closing, let me share this with you. If God cared and supernaturally intervened so much in preparing the universe, the earth, and all of its life for the entry of human beings, how much more must he care and want to supernaturally intervene in the life of every one of you? You know, it tells us in Psalm 147 that God knows the name of every star. There's 50 billion trillion stars in the observable universe alone. By the way, do not spend $54 to have your wife or girlfriend named after a star. I can tell you, you can name 7 trillion stars after every human being and not run out. And here's a trivia question. Of all those names that you pay $54 for, how many are recognized by the International Astronomical Union? That many. Save the $54. Okay. But here's the whole point. Those stars are nothing but giant balls of gas. You are way more than a giant ball of gas. God is going to care for you to a much greater degree. And he wants a relationship with every one of you. So I encourage you, check out the evidence, and when you prove to yourself it's true, it's really, that's the point where you can let God take control. And what I learned from the Gideons is this: God knows better than we do what's best for our life. It only makes sense to put him in charge of our life and take direction from him. He knows what's best. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Let's show our appreciation to Dr. Hugh.
Okay, we're going to just stop now and see if anybody has any questions. Does anyone have any questions about that part? And then we're going to watch some of the Q&A.
There was one question in the chat, Bruno, from Peony.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and Peony asked a question that there's some Christians that disagree with the Big Bang, and she says she doesn't understand why they disagree. And that's because they see the Big Bang as being a model of evolution. They don't realize that it has nothing to do with evolution of life from at all. It's just the way the universe formed. But they think that it's a similar thing. They see that they don't recognize that God was involved in that whole process.
I thought I heard Hugh Ross say something about life beginning on day one. And I'll have to check my notes on that, because just my intuition on that is life came later. So what kind of life started on day one? Was it just plant life?
Well, bacteria would have started, I think bacteria would have actually started on day one when light from the sun was visible. And we know from, that there was a heavy cosmic bombardment of meteorites hitting the Earth up until the point where the oceans were able to cool. And the evidence is that once those oceans cooled, there was bacteria in the water. So you could say that bacterial life began on day one. I think even maybe even slightly before, when would the atmosphere been clear enough to see light on the surface? It would have been after that, right?
I think so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, long after. We don't actually know when life began, which is quite interesting. It's one of the biggest things that we talk about in terms of the origin of life, but Scripture doesn't speak to that particular point. And so we don't actually know when God actually created life. But you did allude to the late heavy bombardment, which was about 3.9 billion years ago. And that was a global sterilizing event. If there was life on planet Earth, it would have been essentially wiped out. And as you pointed out, though, there were certain forms of life that survived, like so-called blue-green algae and other prokaryotes that we can date to those times, and nothing before. So I'm not personally sure that the life that God created the life after the global sterilization event, when the conditions on Earth were prepared for life, or whether life was created before and essentially wiped out, or perhaps survived through that late heavy bombardment. I'm not 100% clear on that, but what we do know is that if we look at when life began on planet Earth, in terms of the record that we have scientifically, it goes back to after or right at the time of the late heavy bombardment, which is remarkable because that life that we can see in the scientific record was complex, in the sense that it had complex biochemical systems already in place in these blue-green algae, for example, and they appear at a time right after the late heavy bombardment, which is quite remarkable. So either it was a supernatural event, or God supernaturally protected those particular types of life through that period. I hope that helps.
I can imagine something as tiny as bacteria surviving the late heavy bombardment.
They wouldn't. Bacteria would not have survived.
Really?
No.
Yeah.
We're talking about blue-green algae are far more, I want to use the word primitive. They're still not primitive, but they're not nearly as complex as bacteria.
But the heat of the bombardment would have been enough to make if there was any water on the surface, it would all evaporate anyways. There would be no liquid water anywhere.
Really? No oceans or anything?
No.
Oh.
So that's why my personal view, which is consistent with RTB's, is that life, God planted life on the planet after the late heavy bombardment, which is important for all the people that are worried about, the evolutionary paradigm, because life did not have any time to come into existence. People think that because the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and the universe is, approximately 13.7, whatever billion years old, that life has had all that time to come into existence. But they ignore the fact that this very major global sterilization event called the late heavy bombardment essentially was a sterilization event that would have wiped out any life that did exist, primitive or not. And so life is actually very, very short and cannot be explained using evolutionary arguments, certainly not the complexity of life that we have on planet Earth today. in only 33.8 billion years.
So
There
all
had to
that,
have been supernatural intervention.
Because once that heavy bombardment stopped, and then there was it got cool enough that you could have liquid water. Life just it was right there, right at that point. There's only like a maximum of a few million years before the cooling and the fossils that of these bacteria. Actually, though, you don't really see the fossils, but you see certain isotopes in the rock that only can come from life.
Yeah.
so where would all that water have been for that period of time? Like, you figure the oceans are how many kilometers deep, and there was enough heat generated that there was no water. Where would that water go and then come back?
Well, it would have been in the atmosphere, water vapor in the atmosphere. Hot enough that then once it cooled, it was raining basically for I don't know who knows how many years it took for all that water to condense and to fall on the surface. But then it would have covered the whole earth because there was no land yet at all.
And comets as well brought a lot of water.
It probably would have been, at least 300 or 400 feet in depth, but all over the surface of the earth. And then later, if in the video, you saw that there was a graph of how the formation of the continents and how it just jumped a lot about 2 billion years after the creation of the earth. So from most of that time, it was all water. And then there was that big jump when all the different continents were formed. Well, they all formed in one area and then they split apart.
Pangea, I guess is.
Yeah.
So there's another question from Peony. Do you want me to address that one?
Yeah, sure.
Bruno? So the question from Peony is, speaking of bacteria, while there may be no complex life on other planets, have we yet discovered single-celled life on other planets, plant or animal? So the first thing I'd like to say about that question is we have to be careful with the use of the word complex. A bacteria, a simple prokaryotic bacteria, is essentially a very complex organism. It has, the means of replicating itself. It has an information system in DNA or RNA, be it single-stranded or double-stranded. It has, protein manufacturing machinery. It has, waste disposal systems. It has the ability to gather energy, produce energy, all that in a single-celled, so-called primitive prokaryotic bacteria. So I think what you meant by the question, Peony, is obviously we think of more, advanced animals as being complex. But I just wanted to point out that at a biochemical level, bacteria is a very complex organism. And eukaryotic cells, which we all have, are a level of complexity higher, but not orders of magnitude more complex. It's just more complex. So we have to be careful that we don't, fall into that trap. So that's point number one. Point number two is, no, we have not discovered life on any other planet, plant or animal, because everything that has arrived on planet Earth from outer space and which has claimed to have evidence of life in some form of a so-called primitive, single-celled organism or whatever, has been shown time and time again to be contaminated with terrestrial bacteria or fungi or whatever. And so this is why it's important that we capture something from outer space in such a way that it cannot be contaminated by impact with the Earth, terrestrial contamination. And you may recall when we had our last, was our last meeting or 2 meetings ago, when Mike Daly spoke to us, he shared with us about the mission to the asteroid Bennu, where that's exactly what they've done. They've landed on it, they've taken a sample, and that sample is on its way back to Earth. And so it was captured in space. And so that'll be the very first time that scientists have ever been able to capture a sample from outer space and then actually, examine it. The only other example, of course, is the moon rocks that were brought back by Apollo, the Apollo missions. And in none of those cases was there any evidence of life.
Yeah.
Hope that helps. Let's see any other questions. Bruno, do you want to go to the
Yeah,
to
let's start
Hugh's
the Q&A part here.
Dr. Hugh Ross on stage again. Dr. Ross, have a seat. And we're just going to fire away, and then we'll have some questions that, if you want to text any question, 32898, and we'll bring the questions out. Here's a question that we had in the last service that I thought was a good one. Dr. Ross, what is the most compelling... Next year. Let's again thank Dr. Hugh Ross.
All right. Does anybody have any questions for after hearing this Q&A? You mentioned a lot of things about how to share your faith with other believers. Any question, maybe we'll just stop here. Thank you all for coming. In February, we're going to have Dr. Fuzz Rana talk about his new book that he just wrote and released about the anthropic principle and how it applies, how biochemistry fits into that. And hope you can make it for that. And so just thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you all in January. Our next meeting is going to be the week after. I think it's going to be, let's see here, this January the 10th is when it's going to be. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week if you can make it. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much, Bruno. Don, for organizing this. Take care, all. Happy holidays. Happy New Year, everyone.
And Merry Christmas to everyone.
Yeah.
All right.
All
Merry
days.
Christmas.
See you online.